Welcome to our deep dive. Today we're going to be tackling the Hmong language, and
That's fantastic.
we've got some really interesting stuff to get into, I think, about its origins and how it actually works, because it's got a pretty unique structure and sound.
It does.
And we'll even be getting into how it's been represented in pop culture. So lots to unpack today.
Yeah. I think a good place to start would be to address the misconception that there's just one Hmong language.
Right.
When in reality, it's actually a whole family of related dialects.
So, like, it's more nuanced than just saying, I speak Hmong.
Exactly.
So what would be, like, a good example to kind of illustrate that for our listeners?
Well, imagine if British and American English were considered totally separate languages.
Okay.
Instead of just, dialects of the same language.
Right.
That gives you a sense of the kind of diversity we're talking about within Hmong.
And we are talking about a language that's spoken by millions of people globally, but it's not like they could all understand each other perfectly. It's not as simple as everyone being fluent in one universal Hmong.
Yeah, it's more accurate to think of it as a dialect continuum.
Okay.
And for our purposes, we're going to mainly be focusing on the two major dialects that you primarily hear in the United States today, which are Hom Daw, sometimes called White Hmong, and Hmong Leng, which is also known as Green Hong.
And I'm sure those names will raise some eyebrows.
They always do.
When people hear that. So are we literally talking about colors here?
No, not at all.
Okay.
They're definitely cultural markers with historical significance that we could get into.
Sure.
But they don't really describe the language itself.
Okay.
What is really interesting is that both Hmong Daw and Hmong Leng are actually part of a larger language family called the Tuankwendian Yao cluster.
So like cousins within a larger family.
Yeah. Exactly. Really, you can think of it like that. If Hmong Daw and Hmong Leng are siblings, then that Tuankwendian Yao cluster represents the extended family that they both belong to.
So we've got this family of Hmong dialects with Hmong Daw and Hmong Leng being the most common siblings, as you put it here in the U.S., but just how different are they? I mean, could I tell them apart if I just heard them being spoken?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay.
Hmong has a really unique sound system that's already quite different from English.
Right.
It uses tones, aspiration, prenasalization, all these sounds that probably sound pretty foreign to your ears.
Oh, yeah. I've dabbled a tiny bit in trying to learn, and that was definitely the hardest part for me, was wrapping my head around hearing the tones and how much they change the meaning.
Yeah, it's definitely something that you have to kind of train your ear for.
For sure.
But here's the thing. Even within Hmong, there are key sound distinctions that set these dialects apart. And it's those subtle variations that can actually make all the difference.
Gotcha.
For example, you can take the name of the dialects themselves, Hom Daw versus Hmong Leng.
Right.
If you focus on that M sound at the beginning, in Hmong Daw, it's pronounced with aspiration, so it's kind of like a breathy.
Okay.
But in Hmong Leng, it's just a regular M.
Oh, wow.
That one tiny difference is actually a major indicator of which dialect someone is speaking.
That's incredible that one little sound can make that much of a difference.
It really can.
Wow, that actually reminds me of how a Jew's harp, which is that small instrument, can be used for more than just music in Hmong culture.
Oh, yeah.
I remember reading that and was just floored. Like, how is that even possible?
You've actually hit on a really important connection there, because it all goes back to the tonal nature of Hmong.
Okay.
So in Hmong, the meaning of a word can change completely based on the tone in which it's spoken.
Right.
And because a skilled musician can actually control the tones of the Jew's harp, they can basically use it to hold entire conversations.
Oh, wow. So it's like a secret code almost within the music.
That's a really good way to put it.
That's really cool. Our research also mentioned another dialect called Danan Shan. Is that part of this same family? Are we talking about like a distant relative here?
It's more like a respected elder in the Hmong language family.
Okay.
Dananchoin is considered the standard for Hmong within China.
Gotcha, yeah.
It's based on a dialect spoken in the Sichuan, Guizhou, and Yunnan provinces.
Okay.
And it's what's used in education and official contexts.
So kind of like the Oxford English of the Hmong world?
Exactly.
But with a more Chinese influence, obviously.
You got it.
Okay, interesting. And speaking of how language is taught and learned, let's transition to talking about the writing systems for Hmong, because I was shocked to learn about how many there actually are.
Right.
I had no idea that there were over 24 different writing systems that have been developed.
It's a lot.
For Hmong, I mean, we're talking systems using Chinese characters, the Lao alphabet, even invented letters.
It's pretty incredible.
So it seems like a very adaptable language.
It really is, and it speaks to the resilience of the Hmong people.
Yeah.
and their commitment to their language, even when faced with a lot of challenges.
Right, and that makes me think of that Hmong folktale
Oh, you know the one?
about the cows and the rats
Yes.
that ate their book of knowledge.
Exactly.
Like, that's always stuck with me.
It's a good one.
It's such a powerful story.
It is. It's a really powerful metaphor for how external forces have really disrupted
Right.
the transmission of Hmong language and culture throughout history.
Yeah, and yet, despite that, the language has survived.
Well, and that's the important takeaway.
Right.
Even without a physical book,
Right.
the Hmong people kept their language alive through storytelling,
Of course.
songs,
Right.
everyday conversations.
Right.
Well,
Oral tradition.
exactly.
Keeping it going. But obviously now in the 21st century, there are written forms
Well,
of Hmong.
Yeah, in fact, because of that resilience and adaptability, Hmong has a really rich tapestry of writing systems,
Yeah.
each with their own story to tell. And I think we should dive into the most important ones
Let's do it.
after a quick break.
So we're back and ready to delve into these Hmong writing systems.
Right.
Where do we even start?
Well, let's start with probably the most common one you'd encounter, especially in the U.S., which is RPA. It stands for Romanized Popular Alphabet.
Oh.
And as you might guess, it uses the same Roman alphabet that we use for English,
Right.
but with some clever adaptations to capture those unique Hmong sounds that we were talking about.
So theoretically, could I sound out a word written in RPA even if I don't actually speak the language?
You could give it a shot,
Okay.
although English pronunciation is tricky enough as it is.
True.
And RPA definitely has its own quirks.
Okay.
It doesn't always follow English spelling conventions.
Right.
For example, you can take the word Hmong itself.
Okay.
The way we spell it in English is actually a simplification.
Okay.
The RPA spelling is closer to Hmoob,
Hifhoob.
which gives you a better idea of the actual pronunciation.
Right. It's like when you see Hmong names spelled
Yeah.
in ways that look kind of strange at first glance.
It's like, okay, they're trying to capture the sound.
Yeah, it's all about trying to help English speakers at least get close to those Hmong sounds.
Right. Get it right.
But RPA is not the only script in town.
Of course not.
We've also got Paha.
Yeah. This is the one that was created by a spiritual leader, right?
That's the one.
Which I'm still blown away by that someone could just invent a writing system
It's really remarkable.
from scratch.
Yeah, in the late 1950s, a Hmong spiritual leader named Shang Lu Yang created Paha.
Okay.
And it's a writing system with 81 unique symbols.
The one.
81.
Wow.
But what makes it even more incredible is that he wasn't literate in any other language at the time.
What?
He developed this entirely from his own understanding of language
Wow.
and the desire to represent Hmong in a written form.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's a really powerful testament to
Wow.
ingenuity and the resilience
Totally.
of the Hmong people.
So we've got RPA, which is kind of the practical adaptable system, and then Paha, this incredibly creative one.
Born out of spiritual inspiration.
Exactly.
What about Nyaking Pashu?
Yes.
Our notes mention that it resembles some other alphabets,
Yeah, you're right on the money there.
right?
Nyakim Kwashu emerged in the 1980s,
Okay.
and it drew inspiration from both the Lao and Hebrew alphabets.
Interesting.
And what's interesting about this one is that it was developed not only as a way to write Hmong, but also to help clarify some of the language's nuances to make the meanings even clearer in writing.
So it's like each of these systems is kind of addressing a different aspect
Like they're all pieces of the puzzle.
of the Hmong language.
Yeah,
That's really cool. What about Danan Shan, the standard language that we talked about?
right.
Does it have its own writing system?
So remember how we talked about Chinese characters?
Yeah.
Well, the Danshan standard actually uses a pinyin-based system,
Okay.
much like Mandarin Chinese,
Right.
which makes sense because its development was really closely tied to the linguistic landscape of China.
Right. Where Pinyin is the standard.
Exactly.
Okay. So it's like all of these writing systems tell a story about
Mhm.
the Hanum people,
Yeah,
their interactions, their adaptations.
exactly.
It's really cool.
It's a good reminder that language is fluid
Yeah,
and that it's constantly evolving
for sure.
alongside the people who use it.
Yeah. And speaking of evolution,
Yeah.
let's move on to Hmong grammar,
Okay.
because I know that it has some pretty unique features
Does.
that I think will really kind of challenge the way we think about language, especially if we're coming from an English-speaking perspective.
Absolutely.
So hit me with your best Hmong grammar highlights.
All right. So get ready for a bit of a shift in perspective.
Okay.
Because Hmong is what we call an analytic language,
Okay.
which means that word order is absolutely paramount
Okay.
for conveying meaning.
Gotcha. So unlike English, which relies on inflections, those little add-ons like ing
Right.
or eed or ease at the end of verbs,
Exactly.
Hmong relies on the order of words
The
to
order.
tell you who's doing what to whom. You got it.
So it'd be like, instead of saying I walked quickly, it'd be more like I walk quick.
You're catching on.
Okay.
Yeah, it's all about the placement of those words.
Gotcha. And then there's also classifiers, which are a whole other thing.
Classifiers. Yeah, they're pretty fascinating.
I always found those really interesting and kind of hard to wrap my head around.
Well, they're not just random additions. They're actually essential
Okay.
to making a grammatically correct sentence in Xmom.
Give me an example, because my brain needs an example to understand this.
Okay, so let's say you want to say, I saw a dog in Xmom.
Okay.
You can't just say, I saw a dog.
Right.
You need a classifier between the verb and the noun.
So it's like I saw one of dog.
Think of it more like I saw a dog,
Okay.
because these classifiers categorize nouns based on their shape, their size, or other characteristics.
Okay.
So there's one for animals, there's one for flat objects, there's one for long, thin objects.
I see.
You can't escape them. And here's the kicker. The classifier that you choose can actually change the entire meaning of the sentence.
Okay, now you've got to explain that one, because that just broke my brain a little bit.
Right, so let's stick with our canine friends.
Okay.
If you say, I saw a tug dog, using the classifier for animals,
Okay.
it means you saw a specific dog, the dog.
Okay.
But if you say, I saw Ibe dog,
Yeah.
using a different classifier,
Yeah.
it means you saw a dog, any dog.
Wow.
So that one tiny word
Wow.
can completely change the meaning.
That's very nuanced.
It's extremely nuanced.
Wow. Okay.
And it actually highlights a really cool connection between Hmong and other Southeast Asian languages like Thai and Vietnamese, which also use classifiers.
Right. Right.
So it's a really interesting example of how languages borrow and adapt features
Wait.
from each other throughout history.
So word order is a driving force.
Yes.
And then we've got these classifiers that add all these layers of meaning.
Exactly.
And what else is in the Hmong bag of grammar tricks?
How about something called serial verb construction?
Okay.
It might seem a little mind-bending at first,
I lay it on me.
but essentially you can string together multiple verbs in a row, all sharing the same subject.
So like instead of saying I went to the store and I bought some milk, it would be I go buy milk.
You've got the gist of it.
Okay.
Of course, it's a little more elegant than that.
Okay.
Our sources actually provided a really good example from White Hmong.
Okay.
It's a little bit of a mouthful, but it really demonstrates how these serial verbs work.
Hit me with your best Hong.
All right, so are you ready for it?
I'm ready.
Okay, here we go. Yam zu, saj plaus, ne yuav, tsum, mus riav, nuguyos saib.
Okay, I think my head just spun around.
I know, it's a lot, right?
I did catch mus, which I know means to go,
Okay.
but the rest of that was
It's a mouthful.
a whirlwind.
So essentially what that translates to is the best thing you could do is to explore your neighborhood and find out what services are available.
Okay.
And so you can see how those verbs, explore, find out, are available,
Right.
are all conveyed through this length chain of verbs in Hmong.
Gotcha.
Mus koyav, nuz kiyos, saib.
I see. So they're all kind of like holding hands,
They're all linked together.
working together,
Like the Greek
gave
one,
that
yeah.
full meaning.
And it creates this really interesting flow and immediacy
Yeah.
in the way that you express a sequence of actions.
It's fascinating how even the grammar itself can reflect like a different way of seeing the world
It really does.
and experiencing the world.
Absolutely. And that's what I think makes exploring Hmong so captivating.
Yeah.
Because it challenges our preconceived notions about how language should operate.
Right.
And it opens up this whole universe of linguistic possibilities.
Totally. I'm really starting to see now how all these pieces fit together.
Yeah.
The tones, the classifiers, those verb constructions.
Mhm.
It all comes together to make this really expressive and intricate language.
It really highlights that language isn't just a tool for conveying information.
Right.
It's a window into a culture's worldview.
Yeah,
It's a way of making sense of the world around us.
for sure.
And I think Hmong offers this really fascinating glimpse into a mindset
Okay.
that prioritizes specificity, interconnectedness,
Uh-huh.
and that seamless flow of action.
So we're not just learning grammar rules here.
Yeah.
We're learning a different way to see the world,
Exactly.
which is really cool. And before we wrap up, I do want to touch on how Hmong has been represented in pop culture, because I know that was something that we wanted to get to.
Absolutely.
And I think the biggest example that comes to mind for me, and that was in our research, is Clint Eastwood's Gran Torino,
Yes.
which is such a powerful film, and I think it really brought some needed attention to the Hmong community here in the U.S.
For sure. And it wasn't just a mainstream movie that happened to feature Hmong characters.
Right.
It actually gave a platform to Hmong actors.
And the Hmong language.
And the Hmong language.
Crucially,
Because they were really speaking it.
they were. And what's even cooler is that the actors actually improvised a lot of their dialogue in Hmong,
Oh, wow.
which really added this layer of authenticity that resonated, I think, really deeply with audiences. Yeah, it's amazing how much of an impact a film can have in terms of like breaking down barriers, creating understanding. And I feel like Gran Torino is a great example of that.
Absolutely. But it's not the only example of Hmong making its way onto the big screen.
Right.
Our research also mentioned films like Bittersweet Tears in 1985
Yeah.
that also showcased the diversity of stories and perspectives within the Hmong community.
And it just goes to show you that language is not this like static thing. It's constantly evolving. It moves with the people who speak it.
For sure.
And reflects all of their experiences and their creativity and their resilience.
It's a beautiful thing.
And on that note, I think that's a really great place to wrap up our deep dive into the world of Hmong.
I agree.
It's been so fascinating learning about this language.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure.
From its really unique sounds to the grammar to just how much it reflects the culture of its speakers.
Absolutely.
And I hope that our listeners out there enjoyed coming along on this journey with us and that you learned something new. And if you did learn something new today, make sure you come back next week when we'll be tackling another fascinating language.
Sounds great.